One of these you may have to use a extension with a like a union type one to get it at the angle, and you just want to get that tight like that. Okay, and it's ready to go. Okay, we're now ready to mount the upper shifter assembly, but before we do that, we have to go ahead and transfer the pivot cup from the OEM unit to the MGW unit. And it has some white grease. We're going to re-grease the whole assembly, but don't wipe that grease off. There's no reason to. You just pop it off there, and if you see, I just pushed it with my thumb. And then to put it on here, you just want to push real hard and it snaps right on, and just make sure that it moves freely. It should pivot freely and not feel jammed in any way. But it also should not wobble. It shouldn't be loose. Okay, we're now ready to mount the upper shifter assembly onto the lower shifter assembly, and we're doing this on the desktop again to just make it a lot clearer so you can see it in a much better light than inside the cockpit of the car. As you can see, the lower shifter assembly has a small pocket milled into the base right here. That is for the return spring for the 3 to 4 gate. The kit comes with a spring and 2 machined hardened spring caps. Now, we designed this shifter to use a spring cap on both ends of this spring, and we strongly recommend that you use it that way. That gives really the best positive return to the 3 to 4 gate, and it really makes the shifter snap back with authority. If for some reason after a couple of weeks use you decide that it's just a little too stiff for you, all you need to do is remove one of the spring caps, and we prefer it's the one that's facing down inside the base. Put the spring in without the bottom spring cap, and you will lessen the spring force. But again, we recommend that you do it the way we designed it. These springs will lose about 10% of their force after about 500 miles, so it will break in nicely. So give it a little bit before you make that judgment call. Now, to put the springs in, we provide a cup of special automotive grease. You want to take the spring and you want to dip one end in the spring, work the grease into the coils of the spring, and then press one of the spring caps into the end and just make sure it doesn't fall out. Then you want to turn it over and do the other end the exact same way. Just work the grease in there, take the other spring cap, work it in, and then you just simply want to lay that spring inside that pocket. With the remaining cup full of grease, you basically just want to remove the grease either with your fingers or with a small putty or spatula, and you want to very generously fill in this area, getting grease on the rod that goes front to back, and also fill up the pivot cup, and go ahead and use all the grease up in there. That way it assures that the pivot mechanism stays very nicely lubricated. And if you want to keep some for later in case you want to go ahead and re-grease this in a few years, that's good too, but that's plenty in there. And actually, if you want to articulate it, it will be connected to the transmission, but you should be able to push it front to back a little bit in between 3rd and 4th gear to access the rod here and get some grease on the rod down here as well. Just make sure that you pop it back into neutral, and make sure that you're back into neutral before you try to assemble the upper shifter assembly. The next step is to go ahead and mount the upper shifter assembly, and to do this you have to kind of work some things together at the same time. You have to make sure that you guide this spring into the pocket of the upper base assembly, and at the same time also make sure that the pivot cup is going down inside the selector. That's why it's very important that you're in neutral, so you can have the shifter kind of centered and work everything in. And you'll feel, don't let this spring fall over, and make sure the spring cap doesn't fall out. Just kind of feel it around, and you'll feel it pop into the hole. And you'll feel the pivot cup work itself into place. Now, the spring pressure will be pretty strong, so make sure you push it and hold it down. And this may be a good idea to have maybe somebody helping you to hold it down while you're feeding one of the screws in. That's why we also use a cordless screwdriver or little impact screwdriver with a 3/16 Allen wrench driver bit on it, and you just simply lock the bolt in. And once you lock the one bolt in, you'll be able to release it to tighten the other 4. Now these bolts are grade 8 bolts, and they also have a nylon locking patch. Again, if you want to use a little blue Loctite on it, that's a good added precaution, but the locking patch will make sure that it doesn't come loose on you. Now again, this back bolt on the rear right-hand passenger side is a little hard to get to, so you do have to articulate your driver bit a little bit and push down on the assembly into the car or pull it up a little bit in order to get that started. That is one reason why we've saved the mounting of the rear support bracket on these pins for last, so that you can push it up and down to do that. Okay, we're going to mount the rear support bracket onto the back of the shifter. As you can see, one side of the bracket has a metal plate. That plate should be pointing to the rear of the vehicle, so it should slide onto the rear stainless pins with the 2 little nipples sticking out the front. Just want to bring this up here and slide it right onto those 2 pins. Line it up with the studs of the vehicle, and then just push it straight up, and it should have enough resistance to hold itself in place, but if not, you'll just have to hold it in place while you start the lock nuts. Okay, this is the OEM nut, which we are going to reuse, but MGW also provides a fender washer and a lock washer, which we want you to use with it. The reason we do this is because this is a very small 6mm stud and nut, and you cannot torque this down much at all, or you will snap that thread or strip the thread. So you want to utilize the fender washer, the lock washer, and some of the blue Loctite to put on the nut when you tighten it up, and then just use wrist pressure with your ratchet driver. Do not over tighten these 2 bolts. And again, we have to use a deep well 10mm socket for clearance of the studs. That's it. Okay, like we showed you over on the desktop, we mounted the upper assembly onto the lower assembly, and there it is mounted inside the car. And we're ready to button everything back up. Now, MGW provides a long little sheet of Dynamat Extreme here. This is a good sound and thermal barrier, and it's an optional feature, but we decided to include it because some people want to button this thing up and get as little sound and heat as they can. Even with the stock setup, it's useful. So you can cut it up into varying widths and strips, and we basically cut up a thin strip here to run along the side of the shifter there, right next to the wires. And you can put another piece right there. And just keep in mind, you don't want to close up or overlap the oval hole, because that's where the rubber dust boot's going to be. So just make sure you stay away from that area. And you can see the factory does patch a couple of these bolt holes, but we want to go one step further and kind of work this stuff down inside the back there and lay flat there. And that really does help keep a lot of that engine heat out of the cabin area. And also, if you want, with this last piece, a lot of people actually, before they even put the shifter in, you can actually line the underside of that with some Dynamat Extreme. That deflects some of the exhaust temperature and road noise back down to the ground. So we will skip it at this, but if you want to do that on the underside before you put the shifter in place, that's another option that you can choose. Okay, now we're ready to fit the MGW dust boot. As you can see, it has a small hole on the bottom side. That hole actually has to be stretched around this groove in the base of the MGW shifter. And in order to seal out the noise, that is a very important step. You cannot just simply push the boot over top of it and put the outside seal on. you need to make sure that this hole snaps into that groove. And it takes a little bit of fighting with it. You have to pull this and stretch this open. Now you also notice that this is not round. This is an oblong oval boot, and it goes this way. It does not go wide way left and right. The wide way goes front to back. Basically the seam should be facing front to back like that. So you want to just stretch it and make sure that you get over the reverse plate, not inside the reverse plate. And just feel your fingers underneath there, pull up on the boot lightly, and you can work it all the way around that groove. And it fits really nicely, and once it's fit, you'll know it's in there because you can pull hard on it. If you pull up on it like this and it slips off, you didn't have it seated correctly. Once you have it seated correctly, then you just want to work the boot and make sure, see how this boot has a wider flange at the bottom? That wider flange gets tucked inside the oval and flares out on the underside of the car, and the small flange sits on the top of the oval, and that seals the noise out really well. So you got to make sure that you do this correctly. And you can use a little fitting putty knife, screwdriver or something if you can't get your fingers in there well. Just be careful, don't rip the boot. Okay, once you get the base sealed, then you want to snap the top of the boot into the groove, into the upper, and you'll see that it's got a groove all the way around the oval. And it is designed to actually curl up like that so that when you articulate the shifter, it has a little bit of a bellows there, so that it's perfectly normal when you have that in place correctly, that it should curl up like that on you a little bit. All right. Okay, once the inner dust boot is in place, we're ready to put back the OEM thermal barrier and sound barrier. And you just work that thing inside the console. Just like that. And then MGW provides an additional thermal and sound barrier that actually has a leaded core, which actually gives a little bit more thermal and sound insulation than the factory provides. And that has an oval cutout that goes in just like that. And the rear of this pad actually has slits in it in the back that you'll push those studs that stick up through those slits just like that. And then this back piece with the little connector pushes onto that stud there. And that's all sealed up. And then we are ready to go ahead and reattach the electrical connections. Remember, this one black connector just pushes onto the threaded stud that's sticking up. And then this white connector goes inside this hole into the console. And then you just kind of work the plug in right there so that when we put the console on, it'll snap in. The little push in should be facing the inside of the console, just like that. Okay, the next step is to go ahead and attach the threaded shift knob shaft with the appropriate thread of your choice. And this shaft comes with a smooth washer, which will go on first. Then the heavy duty lock washer goes on next. And then the jam nut obviously stays